To Romans 13 and take out your sermon outline as well if that helps you to follow along. We are continuing our year-long series through the book of Romans. And I know I say it every week, but I just want to be clear. We are not just talking about politics 2 weeks before the election because I thought this would be a fun way to get fired. This is just what's next in Romans, right? So we're going through the book over the course of a year. We're covering every verse, and today we come to Romans 13. Last fall when we were planning out this series and I knew Romans 13 was coming and I looked at the dates and I thought, can I go on vacation? I don't want to, 2 weeks before a presidential election is not the time that I want to talk about this. And my reasoning was, I thought, for 5% of our church who are sort of political enthusiasts, this is going to be, a time when maybe they're a little frazzled, a little intense, a little anxious, and they're not going to be the most receptive to wanting to hear about this. Now, actually, as I prepared the sermon this week, I realized I'm actually not worried about the 5% anymore. I actually realized this passage is actually offensive to 100% of us. Right? Because you can't just read this passage and say, well, I'm not that into politics. I'm really more of a Hallmark Channel person than a CNN person. I don't really pay attention to that. This doesn't really have anything for me. Well, this passage at its core is a passage about authority. Authority, right? And are you willing to live under authority? And I know something about you, which is that you don't like living under authority. And the reason I'm confident in saying that to 130 people or whatever is because you and I are all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they didn't like living under God's authority. And neither do we, right? We don't want someone telling us what to do. Right? We also look at the Old Testament. We look at Israel didn't like living under Moses' authority. Right? We look at children who don't like living under their parents' authority. We see employees who don't like living under their boss's authority or citizens who like living under their government's authority. This is for all of us. And I'm going to make an assumption right now, or guess, that for some of you, me talking about authority makes you uncomfortable, just even the word. And you might say, what is this, some sort of authoritarian church? Which, when you think about it, is hilarious because the word authority has become an insult in our culture, right? Authoritarian is just someone who exercises authority is seen as a stigma these days. So why is that? Now, I admit, this sermon would be different if we were in South Korea or Ghana or the Philippines, cultures and countries where deference to authority is more the cultural norm. But as Americans, we're actually known for being suspicious of authority, right? All the way back to don't tread on me, and you can take your tea and get out of here with it, right? And it's habituated in the movies that we watch. Think about some of these movies and the way they depict authority. Authority in Star Wars, good guy or bad guy, right? Top Gun, old one, new one, same movie, doesn't matter. Authority, good guy or bad guy. Hunger Games, authority good or bad? The Matrix movies, right? Is the authority good or bad? The Bourne movies, is the authority good or bad? Now, my goal in saying this is not to say don't watch movies or don't watch these. I actually like all those movies, especially the new Top Gun. If you haven't seen it, very, very predictable, but fun, right? All I want to point out is that you and I are swimming in a culture that does not like authority and is suspicious of authority and tells us to question authority. Obvious implication being what authority do you have to tell me to question authority? But there's kind of an infinite regress. So when we come to a passage that says every authority is put there by God, we as Americans are coming at a -10 before we even get to ground zero of this passage, right? We're already suspicious, our guards are already up, and we're uncomfortable with it. This is ironic, of course, because all of us experience authority every day, and we know that we need it. Right? Have you ever spent time in a home where there are children who have no authority figure over them? Maybe a parent who's absent or abdicated or refuses to exercise authority over their kids? It's chaos, right? Or imagine a church without good authority. Where everyone teaches whatever they think about God, whatever they think, and they don't treat the Bible as authoritative. They don't listen to their elders. They just do and say whatever they want. What kind of church would that be? Or imagine a state or a country without good authority, without a police or without the rule of law or without a functioning government, right? Places like Haiti or Djibouti or other places in the world, we know we don't want to live in those sorts of environments, right? We're going to see how the Bible today talks about our need for authority and what it tells us about God. We're going to talk primarily about political authority, yes, but I hope that you'll take some of the things in this passage and cause them to reflect on other aspects of authority in your life as a Christian as well. All right, let's get into it. Romans 13, verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So what does Paul say is the relationship between God and the governing authorities? He says every governmental authority in the world has been established by God. That's an astonishing statement, isn't it? Every authority? I mean, you could probably think of a couple that you can kind of see God's hand in. You know, maybe you look back through history and say, yeah, Abraham Lincoln seems like the guy God would want in that role. Winston Churchill, seemed like the kind of a funny-looking guy, but seems like the right guy for England. But most leaders around the world today, or in American history, you think, I don't know, at best, that wasn't my first choice. That was God's first choice for that role. That was the first, and then we're not even talking about like the wicked rulers in history, the Pol Pots or the Stalins or the Hitlers. So what does it mean that these are God-established leaders? Well, it's saying that every ruler in the world is under the authority of God. Every ruler in the world is under the authority of God. There are no kings, dictators, prime ministers, presidents, any other title that puts someone outside the line of God's authority. Now, to clarify, right, we're not saying God's established authority is the same as church established authority. This is not some sort of callback to the Middle Ages where popes had to put crowns on kings' heads or anything like that. Right? We're saying something broader, right? Whether a ruler is voted in, stages a coup to get into power, inherits the role from the parents, whatever, right? God is the one who is in control. And this should be of tremendous comfort for us. In 2 weeks, we will have an election in our country, and God's providential will be done. If Vice President Harris wins, then God has established her as the President of the United States. If former President Trump wins, then God has established him as the President of the United States. If Jill Stein wins, you'll know it was God that the Green Party won an election, right? So it's a deep cut from the Green Party there. Now, we can be anxious about these things. We can have opinions about these things. We can have deep convictions about these things. But we hold them all under the providential rule and reign of God. Now, let's talk about the apologetics question that's behind this. We look at this and we say, okay, if every ruler is God established, I've got some questions about the people he's picked. And maybe you're not talking about 2 weeks from now, but maybe you're looking through history and you're talking about some of these wicked rulers like Pol Pot and Stalin and Hitler and others. Like, why would we possibly say that God established these terrible people? Well, let's start with a negative, right? We respond to these things not by saying Paul was naive, right? He just didn't know how hard we'd have it in 2024, right? The governing leaders during the time of Paul were wicked people. I know I've used that word a couple times, but I'm not using it lightly. Paul describes the government as God established of the Roman Empire during the time of Caligula. Now, if your Roman history is a little fuzzy, you might have heard the name Caligula but not know much about him. He was the emperor of Rome who was known to history as the Mad Emperor. This is the person that Paul says is God established to rule and to reign. Now, Caligula probably would have liked that because he saw himself in that sort of delusion of grandeur. During his early years as emperor, he seemed to have made some rational choices, but as he got older, maybe there was a mental illness, maybe just being in power was intoxicating, I don't know, but he started doing some pretty crazy stuff. Caligula felt like the god Neptune, the god of the sea, had offended him, so he sent his troops with swords to attack the waves. He also appointed his horse to be a senator, and then elevated the horse to proconsul, the modern equivalent of our vice presidency, because apparently the horse had done an excellent job as a senator. I don't know. There's a joke about how does a horse vote? Nay. But anyway, thank you. Thanks. That's you. Thank you. No one came to church for that. No one came to church for that. Now, I realize, the part of me that majored in ancient Roman history wants to acknowledge, historians debate, did he really do some of these things? Are they hyperbolic? But what's not in doubt is that he was a brutal and oppressive tyrant. And Paul wrote that these are the people that God had established over the Roman Empire. Right? Paul himself would end up being imprisoned and eventually executed, in all likelihood, by the Roman government. So let's not have any nonsense of Paul wrote Romans 13 because he just really liked his government. Maybe you would say, well, I could believe in God establishing governments as long as they do the things I like. Well, that wasn't Paul's experience at all when he wrote this. Instead, notice the comfort that comes with Paul's words, right? Even when the ruler of your country seems as far removed from common sense as Caligula, no one comes to authority outside the scope of God's will. No one. Not in Paul's day and not in ours. Now, please don't mistake this for the way that this passage was kind of twisted in European history. Right? The czars and monarchs of Europe like to take this passage and say, well, God has established me to rule and reign, and therefore I will crush all opposition. The czars of Russia were especially known for this. Right? Monarchs and despots like to use this verse to totally out of context to say that God has established them and therefore no one can oppose them. We'll talk more later in the message about what do we do when our governments act unjustly and how do we respond. But let's just focus on this verse for a second and recognize what it says. Right? If God's providential will is that whomever is in power, God's will is shown by whoever is in power, it's similarly shown by whoever overthrows that person and takes over power. Right? God establishes the authority, yes, but the players change. To put it in the form of Russian history, right? Was it God's will that Tsar Nicholas was the Tsar in 1918? Sure. But it was also God's providential will that the Bolsheviks overthrew him, right, in 1919. Both of those things are part of God's providential will. If you've never heard of the Russians and the Tsars and Nicholas, I've got a great Wikipedia article for you. I'll send you. You can ask me. It's worth recognizing, though, that most people, most times in history, we're not living under Pol Pot or Hitler or Stalin. We're just sort of blanching at the idea that we're under authority. We just don't like being under authority. And our objections are not based on standing for the truth of the gospel, but we just don't want to be told what to do. And that tells us something more about our soul than about our government. So he says in verse 2, therefore whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. What kind of judgment do you think Paul has in mind here? This is going to be really important in the passage. Do you think he's talking about human judgment? That the government's going to come down on you? Or do you think he's talking about divine judgment, that God will come down on you? Well, let's think about this together. What kind of judgment is Paul thinking about? It seems like he has both in mind. Look at verses 3 and 4. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what's good. You'll receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So far he's been talking about human authority, human judgment, right? And then look at the last part here. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Do you hear how Paul describes the role of the state? They are to mimic the justice of God. Right? A just state mimics the justice of God. This is really essential to see the government's role in carrying out justice, right? Because it helps us to honor the good authority that the government provides. Because we know that we need to live in a society with that kind of good authority, right? We need murderers arrested. We need thieves dissuaded. But we still get anxious over experiencing authority. Any of you ever slow down when you see a CHP on the 405? Even if you're not speeding, you still go from 55 to 50? You're just like, or you're driving through a DUI checkpoint. You haven't had anything to drink in 2 weeks, but you still get really nervous. Put it a Tic Tac, thinking that's going to help. Or you're going through a metal detector at the airport, and you're afraid they're going to arrest you for having keys or something. You know these things are for your good, right? We don't want people driving 120 miles an hour on the 405. We don't want people swerving drunk through our neighborhoods. We don't want people taking a bazooka on an airplane, right? We're grateful for the good authority the government provides. But we still are uncomfortable living under it at times. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that every time the government applies justice, they're doing so justly. When Paul says they do not bear the sword in vain, he is saying they have the right to execute justice on their citizens. He's not saying that every time they execute justice, they are doing the right thing. Of all people, Christians should recognize this, because our whole faith is based on the event where the government wrongly executed the most righteous man in history, right? As Christians, of all people, we should recognize that they sometimes get it wrong because of Jesus. That's always the Sunday school answer, right? Because of Jesus. But goodness, even though we recognize that, it does not mean that they are always wrong. In fact, God has established them for a right and good purpose, to execute justice. Now, this is really important because Christians misunderstand this sometimes and misunderstand last week's chapter and ignore the role of the state. Here's what I mean. Last week's passage in chapter 12 talked about the importance of trusting in God taking vengeance rather than our taking revenge. But that is coupled with chapter 13, right? God will bring vengeance. Chapter 13, what is one of the ways that God brings vengeance? Through the state. Here's why it's important. Sometimes Christians will recognize a crime committed within a Christian community or in a church. I'm thinking especially of abuse in the last 100 years, but other ones as well. And say, we don't need to get the state involved. We can handle that internally. That is an unbiblical position. Right? If you just read Romans 13, that is an unbiblical position. Right? God brings justice through the state. So when there are crimes that are committed within churches, yes, the police should be called, and the state should bear the sword of God's justice intentionally. To refuse to allow God's justice to come through the state is really an unbiblical way to approach things. All right, we've been kind of dancing around. I've had a pretty positive way to describe government so far, but what about when governments do act unjustly? You know, this passage has been abused in church history. It's worth mentioning those mistakes so we don't repeat them. You know, one of the ways this passage was abused and when a government acted unjustly was our own American government in the pre-Civil War time. This passage was often used by pro-slavery advocates in the South to say that Christians in the North could not participate in the emancipation of slaves through the Underground Railroad and had to, by law, return slaves to the South. They said, Romans 13 says you have to abide by the rules of law. This is the rule of law. You cannot be part of that illegal practice of smuggling slaves to the Underground Railroad. So we all intuitively know Harriet Tubman was doing the right thing. Underground Railroad was good. How do you make a biblical argument in response to that? Or do you say, well, it was the law of the land. Christians had no choice but to obey the law of the land. If they didn't like it, they should execute democracy to try to get it changed. Or is there a place for Christians disobeying the law? A similar example would be from the last century when the Nazis used this passage against the confessing church in Germany and said, you have to obey the law. We bear the sword, so you have to operate in line with what we're telling you. Well, how would we respond to that? How could Dietrich Bonhoeffer believe in Romans 13 and still seek to assassinate Hitler? Clearly, that was illegal, right? Murdering the Fuhrer, not in accordance with the law. How do you square those two things together? Well, it's worth thinking about what Paul really is saying here, right? A just government reflects the justice of God and administers the justice of God. When an unjust government is denying the justice of God and administering something other than the justice of God, then the Christian truly has to choose between obeying God and obeying the state. He must always obey God. That's essentially what Peter and John said in Acts 5:29, when they're told by human authorities that it was their requirement to stop speaking about Christ. Do you remember what they said? We must obey God rather than man. We must obey God rather than man. When that moment of separation comes, you have to choose the path of following God rather than man. It's what the midwives display at the beginning of the book of Exodus, when the law of the land in Egypt was that they had to execute every baby boy born to Israel. They had to disobey. It's what Daniel demonstrates in his disobedience of the prohibition of prayer. It leads to him being thrown into the lion's den, but he had to disobey man when it came to choosing man over God. And I hope that you'll have the courage to do that if that choice ever comes in front of you. But let's be honest, that's not the norm of our day-to-day experience, right? As much as we'd like to think we are. We're not the heroic rebels from Star Wars most of the time, or we're not Daniel being forced with the decisions that he was faced with. When we want to rebel, sometimes it's out of loyalty to God, but often says something more about our hearts than about the government we're under. And submission to authority in those moments helps us grow in our faith. That's what verse 5 talks about. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. We don't obey the government just because of our fear of what might happen, but because of our faith in God's control. Jonathan Leeman wrote a wonderful little book called Authority that talks about a lot of these themes. It talks about how we need authority to thrive as a Christian. We need to experience what it means to be under authority to live out the Christian life. And in the book, he points to Jesus himself as our model, that Jesus lived under the authority of the will of his Father. How much more do we need the experience of living under the authority of God ourselves? And it's not just God's authority, but submission, Lehman says, to human authorities is the pathway to growth. Because when we live within those limits, it gives us the capacity to thrive. And only when we live under the authority of good and godly leaders do we benefit from those structures that they lead, families, churches, and the society that God intends for us. If you and I are honest and we look in the mirror, we have to ask the question, how do I do at living under authority? Or am I someone who refuses to be under anyone's authority? And if I am, do I really mean it when I say I'm willing to live under God's authority? All right, last part of the passage, verses 6 and 7. We're just going to talk about taxes real quick because that's never controversial. And isn't that where things often get sticky when it talks about us and the government? Verse 6. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authority are ministers of God. You like calling Caligula a minister of God? Attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. If you don't like the idea of calling our political leaders ministers of God, you're in good company. The church father Origen said that this passage was very difficult for him to say. The idea of referring to political authorities as executing the justice of God has stuck in a lot of Christians' throats for a long time. Why would taxation have been a hot-button issue for Christians in Rome in particular? Now, taxes were the reason the Roman Empire exists, right? They didn't invade Egypt to win hearts and minds. They did it for money, right? That was their goal. Fun fact, they took the tax money from Israel to build the Roman Colosseum. How many Jewish people in Israel do you think benefited from that? None. For Christians in Corinth, where Paul was writing from, taxes probably would have been seen as exploitive, a way taking money from their pockets and putting them into Rome's. There was even more than that in Israel, right, where Paul spent at least his formative years. Taxes paid to Rome would have been seen as obscene, an offense to God, robbing from God's people and giving them to idolaters. And maybe most importantly, for the Christians in Rome to whom Paul's writing, taxes would have been seen as funding their oppressors. You can imagine, I'm just going to assume it was a young man, would have stood up in the church and said, we can't pay taxes to the Roman Empire, right? That's paying the salaries of the very soldiers who are trying to come and arrest us. We can't in good conscience do that. Or someone say, maybe a few years after Romans is written, we can't pay taxes to the Roman Empire. He's literally killing us, right? He's throwing us into the Colosseum or lighting us on fire. How could we participate with such an oppressive government? Does that line of reasoning resonate with you? It has with a lot of Christians over the years. They felt like, if I pay taxes to a government, I'm culpable. I'm participating in what they do. And I can't, in my conscience, be part of that. There were some Anabaptist groups that were pacifists, meaning they didn't believe in the use of force for the military. in the last century that immigrated to Costa Rica and to Uruguay with this very argument. They'd say, we can't live in a country that has a military. We have to leave. We can't participate. Well, I can respect that, but I think that's wrong-headed because of this passage. I think we need to apply this admonition in a way that could be really freeing for you. I think Paul's saying it's not your responsibility what your government does with your taxes. It's not your responsibility to bear the sins of the government that you're under. Right? You don't have to carry that on your shoulders. Yes, you are commanded consistently in Scripture, both here and in Matthew 22, if you owe taxes, pay your taxes. Right? As Jesus famously said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. You don't need to carry the burden of, but what if I pay my taxes and 1/10 of 1 cent is used to something that's ungodly? That's the governor's responsibility before God, not your responsibility before God. But I think we can also apply this admonition more broadly, right? That as Christians, it's not our responsibility to isolate ourselves from society or from the government in particular when there are things that we disagree with or that are ungodly, but rather saying we can contribute what we can contribute, even if we can't control every result that comes out of it. All right, well, let's wrap up here. A couple questions for you to reflect on and pray about. The first one is about your exercising of authority. And many of you here have at least some level of authority. Right? If you're a registered voter or an unregistered voter, a citizen of the United States, you bear the sword in a democratic republic. You have a participation in the authority of the state. How are you doing at bearing that authority? Obviously, we're talking about the election, but also as a parent or as a spouse or as a boss or as a leader here in the church, how are you doing at exercising authority? Is your tendency to be too authoritarian, to be harsh with your authority? Or probably more common, do you tend to abdicate that authority? Say, well, I'm not really that important, I'm not really that big a deal, I don't really have any authority. And as a result, people under you are suffering. So how are you doing at carrying out your own authority? The second question would be, how does your submission to authority reflect your confidence in God? Right? How does your submission to authority, or maybe your lack of submission to authority, reflect your confidence in God? Do you truly believe that God's on the throne? He's on the throne today. He'll be on the throne 2 weeks from now after the election. He'll be on the throne 2,000 years from now and every day after that. Right? Or does your lack of submission to authority reveal a deep anxiety and lack of faith in God's control and in his goodness? Well, I hope that as we reflect on this together and as we recognize Christ's great rule and reign, it gives us the freedom to both participate in our government and also not to be defined by it, trusting that our ultimate well-being and our ultimate concern is what Christ has done on the cross and what he will do to bring us to be with him forever. Let's close our time in prayer. God, I'm grateful for my brothers and sisters who are here who do exercise authority in godly and good ways for the benefit of others, for the benefits of their families, for the benefits of us in the church, for the benefit of those of us in society. I pray for those here who have more authority than maybe the rest of us in the government, those who are here who are in the military or teachers or elected officials, and because of their role in our society, they have to exercise authority for the common good. We pray that you would be glorified in the way they do that. God, when we are frustrated in the weeks to come, when we're disappointed by our government in the years to come, when we feel like things are falling apart or scared of that, God, may our eyes turn back to you, trusting that you are in control of all things. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Friends, we get to respond this morning